In this video, I'd like to summarize some of the effects of expansionary macroeconomic policy on various important variables in the economy. We're going to be looking this in the impact on the short run, a Keynesian model, if you will. And we're going to use as a primary tool this idea of aggregate demand, the total demand for goods and services by consumers, C, by an investment, for example, in housing and factories, plus the government spending. Consumption will increase with national income. Consumption will increase if taxes go down. Okay, so if T goes down, consumption will go up. This reflects that a decision to borrow to buy a new house, to borrow to expand a business or build a new factory, is negative related to the interest rate. Higher the interest rate, the lower the investment. Okay, again, this investment is not investment in the stock market or in a savings account. This is essentially the purchases, borrowing today for investment in these long-standing assets such as a house or a factory. Okay, we're going to be then doing this step by step. Let's say that we have an increase in government spending. That will tend to result in an increase in aggregate demand directly by the government. We will also, so if you have the increase in aggregate demand, you're going to see an increase in output as the private sector ramps up to meet the demand for goods and services by the government. And you would tend to see an increase in employment. So it's expansionary. Government spends more, you're going to have more output and more employment. Now it's important to understand the implication of this increase in government spending on interest rates. Because as we've talked about in a previous video, when we have deficit financed government spending, and recall that's a basic assumption that we're making, that the government doesn't have the funds to undertake this government spending. They borrow the funds, so they issue debt, they increase the supply of bonds in the bond market. The increase in the supply of bonds lowers the price of bonds and raises the interest rate. More supply of bonds, prices of bonds lower, higher interest rate. That higher interest rate will choke off at least some of the expansionary effects of the government spending in the first place. Higher interest rates means it's more expensive to borrow to get a home, to expand your business. Okay? But in the end, in this simple short-run expansionary story, you're going to get higher output, higher employment with the expansionary government spending policies. A tax cut, rather than increasing government spending as we had here, is going to work through consumption decisions. Those tax cuts will increase aggregate demand. It will increase output. It will increase employment. And in a very similar way to the increase in government spending, you see more borrowing by the government because they're not reducing government spending to make up for these tax cuts. Taxes are falling, tax revenue is falling. You're going to then have more borrowing needs. Supply of bonds goes up as the government issues bonds. The increase in the supply of bonds reduces the price of bonds. Interest rates go up. Investment in housing and factories goes down. This part, this negative effect of fiscal policies on interest rates, is called crowding out. In other words, you crowd out at least some private activity because you've increased the demand for loanable funds by the government running a deficit in this setup. Okay, so there's a little bit of downside here. Monetary expansion has a slightly different process of analysis. We talked about how if the central bank purchases bonds in the open market, so they pull in bonds, they take in bonds, they put out currency in exchange. This increase in the demand for bonds raises the price of bonds and lowers the interest rate. Okay, separate video about that. The falling interest rate will tend to increase investment. So this part, people buy that house, expand that company because interest rates are lower. This increase in investment tends to result in an increase in aggregate demand, an increase in output, an increase in employment. So what you see here is that you have primarily different effects on these two parts of this table. Fiscal policy and monetary policy have opposite effects. Expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy have opposite effects on interest rates and has different effects on these variables. Now you might say, well, why would a government choose the tax cuts or government spending when you have this downside of the crowding out as opposed to using monetary policy? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that if you lower interest rates, you really don't know who's going to borrow. I mean, you lower interest rates and there are all sorts of things that could be projects that could be started. You don't really know who. So there's less direct control over the outcome with a monetary expansion because you lower interest rates and see what happens. With government spending, you can have direct effects on, say, infrastructure or social spending or defense spending. You choose where you spend the funds. So yeah, you crowd out some, but at least you can make concrete, conscious decisions about where the expansion occurs exactly. The same way with tax cuts. You can have tax cuts for the middle class. You can have tax cuts for the poor. You can have tax cuts for the rich. You're choosing the source of aggregate demand, but with the downside on the interest rates. Another reason that expansionary monetary policy has downsides really has more to do with the long run. It's subject of a different video. But if it was simply the case that you cranked up the printing presses and expanded the money supply and everything would be great, well, that would be probably too easy of an answer. In fact, there are countries that can have problems with serious bouts of inflation when you have monetary expansion. So that's a subject of a different video. But I do want you to keep in mind that you have these differential effects on some aspects of the economy in expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. Overall general direction's the same, but very different impact on interest rates and investment.